So I may be repeating information that you all know, but for those who might not, I'm John Glassman. I'm the director of the Chabraja Center of Historical Studies here at Northwestern. And among its other activities, each year the center hosts a series of luncheon lectures, each one featuring a guest speaker who's an eminent historian or an historically minded scholar from another discipline. Obviously, during this COVID season, we've had to change our standard format. Instead of formal lectures, our guests this quarter, at least, are going to engage in conversations with some of our colleagues here at Northwestern. Professor Lara Putnam, our guest today, has generously agreed to a two-part visit. The first part was yesterday, which consisted of a stimulating roundtable in which Lara focused on the digitization of archival sources and the opportunities and challenges, including ethical challenges, that poses to historians. Today's event is on something quite different, reflecting Professor Putnam's temporary move away from the transnational focus of our other scholarship to look at contemporary politics in her own backyard. But before we get to that, and before getting to a formal introduction to Professor Putnam, I'd like to say a few words about the Chabraja Center's upcoming fall events, for those of you who weren't present at yesterday's event. Our next speaker in 3 weeks will be James Millward, who's a China specialist at Georgetown, and who, like Professor Putnam, will engage in conversations on two different topics. The first, on October 22nd, will be a works in progress colloquium in which he's going to share a provocative piece that he's working on titled China as Polylith, a New Paradigm for Chinese History and Why We Shouldn't Say Mulan is Chinese. And the next day, on October 23rd, Jim Millward will speak on something that's occupied much of his time in recent years, the current crisis in the Uyghur Autonomous Region of Xinjiang. Finally, on November 19th, Erin McLaughlin of Washington University, St. Louis will offer a presentation illustrated with film clips, as I understand, titled Claude Lanzmann's Shoah and Its Outtakes, The Ethics of Perpetrator Representation, in a talk co-sponsored with the Holocaust Education Foundation. Of course, you're all very welcome to these events, and for more information, you can go to the center's website, historicalstudies.northwestern.edu. That's historical studies, all one word, .northwestern.edu. Today's event will be moderated by Peter Slevin of the Medill School, which is also co-sponsoring this event. Many of you, I think, know Peter. For those who don't, Peter is a contributing writer for The New Yorker who focuses on politics. His articles have covered the meanings and political uses of socialism, the battle for Wisconsin's electoral vote, the Trump administration's revival of the federal death penalty, and the reasoning of the growing number of Republicans who are defecting from Trump and the GOP. Before coming to Northwestern, Peter spent a decade on the national staff of the Washington Post and 7 years as the Miami Herald's European correspondent. He's also the author of a book on Michelle Obama, which was a finalist for the Penn-Jacqueline Bograd Award for Biography. So I'm happy now to hand things over to Peter Slevin, who will introduce our featured speaker. Thanks.
Thank you, John, and hello, everyone. I've been asked to start actually with two logistical points. We have about 80 minutes from now. And should you have questions, and I certainly hope you will, you'll see on your screen a little icon for Q&A. Go ahead and type in a question, and after we get going, I'll take a look, and we'll be lucky enough to ask Lara to talk about them. We are so lucky to have Lara Putnam from the University of Pittsburgh here today. As John said, she is an eminent historian. She's also an engaging one. Her work it crosses boundaries in terms of her research, as well as the topics that interest her, as we will see. Her early work was on the Atlantic world and radical moves, the Caribbean migrants and the politics of race in the Jazz Age. Got some stellar reviews that talk about how Lara is able to communicate complex ideas to broad audiences, something that she's doing in a new way these days, especially on Twitter, where I might point out her Twitter bio is historian, mom, knocks on doors, and talks politics. There you go. So we're going to talk about that. I loved that the Journal of American History said of Radical Moves that it was splendid, engagingly written, and keenly researched. And HNet said that it was a tightly argued case of terrific historical scholarship. So many things, past and present, we could talk with Lara about. Today, we are lucky to talk with Lara about some really impressive and meaningful work that she has been doing, monitoring and studying grassroots organizations, particularly those that sprung up after Donald Trump was elected in November of 2016, how these networks work, how they operate, how they have morphed over time, how people who in some cases started by just being furious with Donald Trump and held up signs, got a little tired of that, and now are active not only in ways that connect with the November election, which of course is already underway with so many already voting, but also have infused themselves into local conversations and policy debates on everything from school policy to prison, the role of prisons, and to Black Lives Matter protests that stretch well beyond inner cities. So we will talk about all of those cool things. I feel very lucky. And Lara, I thought we might start really, since the election is on everyone's mind and we have, boy, what a news day today. What are you seeing on the ground in Pennsylvania? And you have your tentacles out everywhere monitoring.
I mean, first of all, I should say thank you to everyone for having me here, and thank you to the Chabraja Center and to Jonathan and to the center leadership for the invitation, and to you, Peter, for joining this conversation. You and I've been in correspondence recently, and it's just, I think we both agree, talking across these boundaries of history and journalism is a really exciting space of convergence, and they're not conversations that happen often, so I feel really privileged to be part of this. What are we seeing, on the ground in Pennsylvania? There are so many different momentous things happening at the same time, and they're distinct, but they're impacting each other, and they're happening on different time frames, and they're happening for different reasons. And that's a complicated story. So every time anyone tries to make generalizations, and we need to break it down further than that. So the big picture, I would say, is that the election of Donald Trump has both accelerated a movement away from the Republican Party among suburban women and college-educated women, and increasingly men. I should say specifically among suburban and college-educated white men and women who had not been, who've gone from being sort of the bulwark of the GOP a generation ago to now being very much not, right? So that's one story. Another story is the forces that, and the reasons that folks who may not have a college education, people who are living in communities that are less well off, in particular across the Rust Belt, so those areas that I've studied. And I want to sort of be precise about how I'm talking here. I'm not saying often people say, oh, working class Rust Belt, and envision the people who are in the least, have the folks who have the least privilege and who are the least wealthy and the least well off, and who've been the hardest hit by recent, the last decade socioeconomically. Those folks have not so much moved towards the Republican Party as have often moved away from voting at all, are facing a whole bunch of sort of body blows economically, socially, that have, and organizationally, sort of civic organizationally, that have made it hard for people to maintain faith in the voting process at all. And often when, even in this like quick rendition that I've just given, it sounds like sort of demographic chunks of people just sort of move in one direction, like, across, like wildebeest across the savannah, but we know that's not what really happens, right? And so what I have tried to study, and what I think I as a historian am drawn to focusing on, is why do people shift? It's not that there's some kind of magic wand that says, white women assemble here. It's when lots of different people in different places who share characteristics move in a particular direction politically, in terms of their action, in terms of their voting patterns, in terms of their perceptions. It's not because they have some card that says your demographic group is moving. exit stage left, it's because people's life experiences make the shift in common ways and shape their sense of themselves and their understanding of their community and their country and their sense of how they fit, how they and their actions as citizens fit into these broader stories. And so that's not just a story about individual voters or even groups or even collectives of voters and politicians and messages. That's a story about civic organization, right? Some of them intentionally political, others simply sort of social networks, social structures, social organizations that shape the pattern of who I hear, who I trust, what information I encounter, how I make sense of my own life, and therefore what political analysis is persuasive to me, right? And so rather than envisioning sort of like voters being summoned, I sometimes think of it as like the Harry Potter theory of politics. Sometimes when you read political reporting, not by fabulous political reporters, but sometimes quick summaries make it seem like politicians just sort of hold up wands and say axio voters, and the voters just move, you know, through space in a disembodied way. You know, people move towards politics across a landscape which is shaped by human action and by human organizations. And that shapes what I hear and who I connect with. And so that's the story that I've been trying to capture for the last 4 years, is how very rapid civic activity is reshaping the civic and political life within a whole bunch of pretty similar communities across this country with momentous consequences.
And what's so wonderful about that is that you are sticking with it and going deep and looking broadly as well, and looking at these as social movements. So much of political coverage, speaking about the journalism part of the journalism historian overlap, is quick, spot news, dropping in, parachuting in. I noticed that you've admired local reporters who've stuck with a particular place. And I definitely want to get to that and what the media has missed over time. But also what you're describing is the phenomenon that makes it really hard for campaigns to capture what's going on. And the rules have all changed about how to motivate and mobilize those very people you're talking about. Speaking specifically of the just of the election now, are you seeing energy, would you say, among the anti-Trump forces in particular you've described? Are people fired up in Pennsylvania as everybody wonders whether Trump's going to win again?
I mean, for sure, it's the case that the same activists who have come together and worked in sort of rejection of Donald Trump and in opposition to what they see as the direction that Trump's GOP is taking the country, those folks absolutely are fired up and, you know, have been, you know, have to, you know, to quote Spinal Tap, it's like they were up at 10 and now they're up at 11, right? They have taken it up that much more over the last month or so. It's also the case that, you know, folks who are supporters of this president are also intensely fired up and indeed, in many ways, maybe more wholeheartedly so than would have been the case 4 years ago, I think. And I think there's a circular nature in which, as partisan political identities come to feel more and more sort of comprehensive, like it's not just who I'm going to vote for, it's who I am as a person. And so as, you know, there's sort of political sorting has happened in such ways that people are increasingly consider their you know, political allegiance to be so fundamental to their identity that, for instance, people now rank the possibility that they could, you know, they would say, like, how unhappy would you be if your son or daughter married someone who was X? The answer is of the opposite political party. That's now that one of the highest rates of rejection, like anything but that, right? Religion, no problem. Right. You know, race, ethnicity, not that many people now, you know, say that that's something that would be shocking for them, but political.
Are you seeing that equally on both sides? I mean, we all see on social media, you know, I had to block so-and-so because I can't bear to talk to them. I don't go to Thanksgiving, but both sides? Yeah,
well, polling data suggests that it's actually there's certain kinds of polarization in terms of legislative action and politicians' action that are asymmetrical. So the polarization of the voting behavior and legislative mechanics and stratagems embraced by the GOP is really disproportionate to what has happened on the Democratic side within Congress. But on this one issue of sort of how much voters have come to feel that their political identity is actually sort of an overwhelming moral commitment, that's actually pretty similar across the two sides. That's pretty parallel.
Fascinating.
So it has become, and that was already underway and has accelerated in recent years. And so, and part of what's happened in response to that and shaping it, and is that, and in response to a changed media landscape in which there's now a much wider range of semi-partisan, explicitly partisan, implicitly partisan range of media sources, from the formal to the splintered and social media information sources. So many people, consciously or not, most of us, anyone who's consuming news or consuming information, and at some level all of us are consuming information, is we're all curating our information flows with some degree of self-consciousness or not, in ways that mean that people are experiencing this current moment through very different lenses that are shaping what they even think is happening in this world. So there's a fracturing of our information environment, which is responding both to technological changes and to these sort of social and cultural and political changes all at once. And so that's part of what I'm capturing when I say folks are fired up over here. Folks who are strong supporters of the president are now, even more than they would have been 4 years ago, consuming a media, sort of living within social media and media environments that are telling them a version of current events in this country that reinforces their allegiance. So folks are polarized as never before in terms of their allegiance and how much they feel that everything is on the line in this election on both sides.
And the stakes just feel so incredibly high. I want to talk about the activists you've been following and who they are, but on this point, you and I were talking a bit earlier, even about the fact that President Trump has tested positive, how different sides are reacting. There was a Reuters reporter who had been in Duluth at the president's rally in Minnesota a couple of days ago, and she called a couple of people she had interviewed there, and she called them today, and they said, "Oh, it's not true. No, he doesn't really have COVID. They're making it up." And I think you had an experience today too with also a parallel universe.
Yeah, and it's really striking how it's like a momentary camera shot of how little faith there is, both, and there are different kinds of lack of faith. So all shaped by one's political your political priors. So there are some folks, you see some commentators on the left, or folks who are not part of the punditry, but activists speaking in Facebook groups and so on, saying, I don't believe it. Is the president lies about everything? Is the president lying about this? Is this, so every possible, theory of what could be, what's the angle here? And meanwhile, but also equally in, for instance, Facebook groups that have ended up becoming, so among the things I've been sort of tracking and following recently have been the ways that some Facebook groups that don't define themselves as being political have become, especially since the advent of coronavirus, pretty intensely political, and political in the sense of pushing COVID minimization, so minimization of coronavirus, support for President Trump, and those two things have come to go very much hand in hand, and even providing a space for what I think of as sort of QAnon adjacent claims about Democrats, about pedophilia, and so on. So there's spaces that started off as, and still nominally self-present as, sort of community Facebook groups, but have become very rapidly over the course of a few months infused with what an outside observer would simply call disinformation about the coronavirus and about various different claims of conspiracy and so on. So in those spaces, you now see people saying either, don't believe that this is, don't believe that Trump is actually ill. This is, either it's like some kind of galaxy brain move because, some intentional move, some intentional and heroic head fake by the Trump administration, or somehow this is, he was given, someone in the deep state has gotten access to controlling coronavirus testing and is putting out the false information that he tested positive when he didn't. So there's even on these sort of you would think would be like basic facts. The president tweeted that he is coronavirus positive, but even on these basic facts, there's so much distrust in what we're hearing and the stories that we're making out of the fragments of what we're hearing. People are weaving into narratives that fit their prior assumptions.
Well, and what all of that shows too is, and what's so important about your work is you're not looking at what's happening on November 3rd. You're looking at these as movements and seeing where they came from and where they're going. And one of the great questions, of course, is how do we undo that? At what point do people actually trust someone? Not Walter Cronkite anymore, for sure, and there were problems with that. But I just spent the better part of a week last week in Wisconsin, experiencing exactly what you were talking about. Not only was I seeing that Republicans were spreading disinformation, they were holding up signs at a Biden event that I didn't even understand. These were narratives about Biden that are quite grotesque. I'd never even heard of. And then I went to a Republican headquarters in Racine, or Republican office in Racine, and the things that the volunteers there said were so far from any reality I had ever experienced or honestly believed in. I couldn't believe it, but there wouldn't be any shaking them. One of the things I'm curious about is the extent to which these sort of social media configurations are influencing action. Are you able to see a connection between what people are saying in social media and on Facebook and then doing in the communities that you're monitoring?
Yeah, well, I think we've seen that in for instance, the surge of, well, just as you point to people going to, Biden events, as well as people going to Trump events, carrying signs, articulating in the real world their belief in, for instance, multiple different elements of the, QAnon conspiracy theory. And there, of course, have been, over the last, in recent months, we've seen multiple occasions of people showing up with guns in order to enact the role that makes sense to them in the narrative of national struggle that they're hearing. That's something like I describe it that way, and it seems sort of exotic. And if you're on the broad center left, you're like, who are these people? But of course, showing up to take part in collective action because of the national struggle you see yourself involved in is exactly what the women who took part in the Women's March did. They showed up in person with signs to say there's a national struggle underway and here's how I'm going to be part of it. So we shouldn't be, we want to avoid false equivalence, but we also want to avoid somehow making it seem like this is beyond the pale of understanding how one could possibly feel that way, do that, see that, and rather what we need to see fundamentally is that there's an enormous cost to the fact that we have, and it's been accelerated by the moment of coronavirus, information is coming to us through a hyper fractured media systems. And that was true, that has been, increasingly true around the world over the last 5 to 10 years. That's been accelerated by coronavirus because, pre-coronavirus, I might be hearing one thing on Fox News, and then maybe that sets my priors of believability, and then I go to OANN, or I go to a particular subreddit, or maybe I end up on 4chan or 8chan, I hear things that make sense to me. But on the other hand, I probably also go to work, and maybe the folks in the office have a whole different perspective on things. I go to, a PTA meeting and I hear people saying other things. I go grocery shopping and, run into someone who I know from high school and we chat. So in a world in which we are moving around in physical space within our communities and having conversations, we are getting, checks and balances. We're getting some like reality checks that may cause us to, that may sort of cut into the self-reinforcing cycle of disinformation. in a world in which all of us are in our homes experiencing the world through the computer screen in front of us, our experience of our collective reality of this particular moment is mediated, right? It's coming, and so it becomes the sort of de facto friction of everyday life, which has a really salutary effect of keeping us anchored into the same reality, has been radically diminished. And I think this is part of why, that plus the enormously heightened level of anxiety that everyone is feeling in the moment of a dangerous pandemic, plus the fact that certain political actors have seen that their short-term political interests align with pushing this. So that for me is sort of the trifecta of what's happening right now. It's the fear and anxiety, the ramped up role of media, and then the political advantage taking.
And maybe just also the most simple thing of so many people just being in one place indoors, not out and about even very much in some of those settings. And so whatever they choose as opposed to be exposed to online becomes maybe even more strongly the reality, I suppose.
And it's taking up, more of our hours of our day are being lived in spaces at which we are at risk of exposure to, digital information that's not reliable.
I would love to talk about what you're seeing on the left, or at least the anti-Trump forces, which is not all left, as a movement. When you think, you've mentioned the Women's March and what a difference that made and how energizing it was, but also how you've written about how it has morphed, adapted, transformed itself in various ways locally and nationally. It seems so often when people in Trump world are talking about what it is they care about, it is not so much a positive agenda. And yet my sense is that on the other side, it actually is not just designed, to get Donald Trump out of office, but in fact to accomplish things. And I think, doesn't that sort of fit into the work you've been doing as an historian, assessing that as a movement? Tell us about that.
Yeah, and I go back and forth. I'm really loath to use the term a movement, because what I see happening on the broad center to the left is more multi-stranded and diverse and complicated than that, and those actors currently, those voices and those actors, the people who have a national platform and claim to speak for the movement, are actually poorly reflecting what I see on the ground. So I'm hesitant to say that there is a movement, because for sure it's not one that's being articulated by the people who claim it's a movement, if you follow me. Because it is, just as you say, that and yet at the same time, it's not sort of some purely amorphous, there's no pattern. There are really important patterns here. So, I see it as an inflection point, a point at which a wide swath of people who were at somewhat similar life stages, having lived somewhat similar lives. So especially women from their 50s to 70s, who usually had college education or beyond, were sort of well educated within the context of their community. What that meant may be different in different places, and who had the flexibility in terms of time and resources to be able to and had been involved in the civic life of their communities very routinely. Folks who've been involved in the PTO and the PTA and volunteered in this and that, but hadn't necessarily been hyper involved in politics, and particularly not in electoral politics in an ongoing way, saw the election of Donald Trump and were shocked and appalled. And this is part of why, this is distinct from the experiences of, for instance, many urban communities of color with the election of Donald Trump. You heard, and so many of the sort of frontline communities who've been on the receiving end of invective and, policy choices from the president that have been hugely damaging. It's not that, folks in, largely African-American urban communities saw the election of Donald Trump and said, this is going to be great for us. Of course not. But the sense of shock, like, how is this our country? It's not something you usually heard from leaders of color after the election of Donald Trump. not that many, people of color within, Barack Obama's America knew full well that Barack Obama's America remained a place where racism and nativism had great sway, right? So you don't have this shock, like, how could this be our country? How could Donald Trump have been elected? Whereas from sort of broadly liberal, middle-aged, civic stalwart, especially white women, especially in the suburbs, you heard as in interviews again and again, this is not my country. This is not the country that I thought that I lived in, that I thought I was raising my children in, that I want my grandchildren to, grow up in. And these were women again and again with like the flexibility and wherewithal to feel like they could do something about it, and to feel like they were entitled to do something about it. And to do something about it. And so you saw people stepping forward first, actually even before the Women's March, although that was also a catalytic event. You saw people, and I keep saying women, there were also men involved, although in smaller numbers in all of these groups, people forming local groups, calling together neighbors, in some cases, folks who just met glancingly in the final days of the Clinton campaign, calling up the people who they had met while canvassing and saying, what are we going to do now? In some cases, it was people who knew each other from the Obama 08 campaign, who'd formed like neighborhood snowflakes, as the Obama campaign called their sort of local organizing unit, who reached out to the people who had been their sort of core friends in that organizing moment and said, what do we do now? It seems the grownups aren't in charge anymore, it's just us. And so these groups were getting and then the Women's March was another moment of sort of catalytic conversations in which people, stepped forward from their own impulse, from their sense of themselves and their sort of what public role they wanted to play, and then found other people so that they began identifying possibilities for collective action. The protests against the Muslim ban were another moment that brought people out into the public together, and where so for each of these, I can tell you specific groups whose nucleus was people who met at that moment, people who, there's a group which now has hundreds of members in Westmoreland County, in Western PA, which has its nucleus in 3 people who spontaneously met outside the local county courthouse steps when they just showed up in the snow with hands that they had handmade signs that they'd made to protest the Muslim ban. And they thought they were going to be the only ones there, but they were like, if I'm the only person, at least there will be one person standing outside the courthouse saying, this is not, this move is not my America, right? But once people meet each other, they start making plans and what was one of the things that's been so striking to me was within 2 or 3 weeks of people of any given group beginning to meet, holding meetings, having collective conversations, people were already creating subcommittees, creating candidate recruitment committees, and identifying local down ballot offices like, town council, like school board, whatever was the upcoming election. And it was different from state to state because different states have different electoral cycles. Identifying like, what can we run for next? Like, what is the earliest upcoming election for which we are going to, get someone on the ballot and do something locally. And what was so striking about that was that at that moment, the leaders of the Women's March nationally, we're not talking about school board elections. The folks who wrote the Indivisible Guide, which many people were reading, but the Indivisible Guide itself was all about your member of Congress and how to, lobby and advocate vis-a-vis your member of Congress. There was nothing about candidate recruitment, much less about candidate recruitment for school board or coroner or prothonotary. But again, these are things that happened in place after place. So you see this common trends that resulted in people sort of reshaping the organizational environment and the political organizational environment of their local communities.
It almost makes you feel good about democracy. Imagine, there's hope.
Except
we can get to
the things, all of the grim things that we've been saying about how social media is impacting our world are happening simultaneously. Yeah. And this is part of why I said at the beginning, there are lots of really any one of these things would be like an epochal shift within American democracy, and they're happening at the same time in overlapping places.
Someone replied to one of your tweets, I think from Beaver County, saying that they were 20 rogue volunteers, and they have grown into an organization of 700 people. So in taking it to the next step, and I very much appreciate your point that it's not one movement, but so many, so many different layers and so many different interests and ambitions. Are you seeing this spread into effective results in these local communities, not just protest, where these began in many cases in early 2017, but into, I guess you could say, results and maybe momentum pushing upward into the larger political structures?
Sure. Well, I mean, so absolutely. Let's take a couple of different ways in which that happens. First of all, the blue wave of congressional elections in 2018 wouldn't have happened without the massive outpouring of civic engagement and volunteer engagement in community after community after community. So, for instance, when I worked with some colleagues and collaborators to try to find some more quantitative evidence that can give us a sense of whether the patterns that we're seeing on the ground in our ethnographic participant observation work, how widespread are these? And so one thing that we did was count up, we used the number of contacts for different group contacts listed in the Indivisible portal for different places, for different zip codes, as a rough tally of local post-2016 grassroots engagement, even though we actually know that maybe only a third of the individuals or groups who have contact information listed ever actually formed any kind of grassroots group, and quite a few of the groups that were listed, especially when we pulled the data to look at it, some of them were just pre-existing progressive or centrist groups, but it's a good like rule of thumb source, because this is like someone in this place thought to upload information, thought to post online information about how to join them to do stuff, right? So it's in a world in which we have very little systematic information on social participation, it's one data point. And one of the things that was most striking is that if you map those onto congressional districts, the number of group postings, the number of groups listed, is by far highest at what was highest in exactly those congressional districts where the vote totals between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were most narrowly or like narrow. So it's like the most battleground congressional districts, places that were neither, it's neither the most firmly Republican nor the most firmly Democratic districts. It's right in the middle is where the number of group postings was highest. That meant that the impulse, the kind of dynamics and change and organizational, engagement and growth that I've been describing was happening most intensely in exactly the places where it could make most of an impact in the midterm elections, because it was exactly the districts where that were potentially flippable. And indeed, we saw exactly those districts in place after place flip. Mm-hmm. So that's one example. We wouldn't have the Congress that we have if it hadn't been for these kind of changes. But there are also ways in which the existence of this activism, new energy, has had, even though the people who are participating look very much the same from place to place to place, it fits the sort of life trajectory profile that I've been describing, but they've come together and engaged in politics in very different kinds of communities, and therefore the results of that have been quite different. So in more urban areas, in both cosmopolitan suburbs that are closer into urban districts and within cities, often what's happened is that these are people who are coming in who are from outside of the local democratic hierarchy, and who have provided a lot of fuel for challenging that democratic hierarchy from the left, and for breaking up sort of entrenched democratic machines from South Jersey to the Bronx to Queens to Philadelphia. In Allegheny County, in Pittsburgh, the jury is still out on how much breaking up of the local democratic machine is going to end up happening, but the conflicts have become quite intense. And so insurgents, new faces have managed to break into what had been tight hierarchies. And so you have more left-wing candidates, younger candidates, people of color. So Southwest Pennsylvania sent the first African-American woman as a representative to Harrisburg, as a state rep. And I'm not at all saying it's only somehow like the white suburban women who made this happen. I'm saying bringing new energy and money into politics makes it possible for new kinds of alliances to form, and for people who hadn't previously been able to get purchased to get over the sort of bar in order to be able to make their campaign happen. Conversely, some of the same people who knew activists who looked demographically and in terms of their own sympathies pretty similar, out in more rural areas and more exurban or rural areas, have often, you know, similarly organized, similarly looked for local targets for action, and often there what they've done is, you know, recruit and support candidates to challenge Republicans, state representatives, state senators, and so on, who hadn't previously faced any challenger, you know, in recent years on the Democratic side. And so the folks who've been recruited as candidates in those districts often looked, you know, they look like a Democrat should look in that district to have a chance of persuading people. So those you know, grassroots folks in those places, the new grassroots folks, have ended up supporting candidates who are often but not always men, often but not always centrist, not infrequently whose politics are really to the right of the grassroots groups who are doing the supporting. Meanwhile, in the cities, often the candidates who end up being supported may well be to the left of the median views of the person doing the supporting. And again, that's part of the reason that I shy away from talking about it as a movement, because it's a sort of a change in the landscape, and it's a change in the, you know, local ecosystems of politics. It has distinct results.
Yeah, the very things you're describing I've been seeing in Wisconsin as well, where in Western Wisconsin, these were counties that flipped from Obama. They voted twice for Obama. They flipped to Trump. All sorts of people came out of the woodwork and are now, in fact, running. They've taken over the Democratic hierarchy.
In place after place after place, they have become the Democratic Party, and they've completely rejuvenated what had been a really emaciated.
And this notion, too, one of the lessons that the Wisconsin Democrats say they've learned from 2016 is they can't just expect to show up 6 weeks before the election, get people to vote for them. So they've dug in starting in 2017. And I met with two women who are running for the state legislature, Democrats. They expect to win. One is a Mexican-American woman from a working class Republican district outside of Milwaukee. She's winning. She lost last time. She stuck with it. There's now tons of money, which is also coming in. Yeah. And she's way ahead. Yeah. When you, we've gotten a couple of very good questions in the Q&A. You mentioned about the demographics and how those connect with certain issues in these political campaigns, these political efforts. You mentioned the Women's March participants, many of whom were of a certain age and a certain socioeconomic status. What about working class or lower income women or voters or activists who are have tuned out of politics? If you think of Kathy Kramer's book, The Politics of Resentment, where people said, I don't, you know, if they weren't going to vote for Donald Trump, they weren't going to vote at all. Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense that these efforts that you're seeing are bringing people into the political conversation about who weren't in it before at all? And on what issues? Absolutely.
So part of, and I'll name check another book which is in that same vein and is really crucial, wonderful, is Jen Silva's book, We're Still Here, which is a political ethnography of a town in the former coal belt in northeastern Pennsylvania, and exactly captures that sort of deep alienation in working class spaces, and in, you know, places that have been hardest hit by disinvestment, the opioid epidemic, and so on. So what is the places? So has the activism of the sort of more suburban grassroots folks reached out and activated in those spaces, or, you know, found allies? That was a really hard row. So I would say no, with the sort of partial exception that the presence of grassroots activism made it possible to, you know, recruit some candidates to run in places where there hadn't been any campaigning going on the Democratic side, and in some cases those campaigns then have you know, elevated new voices and new figures who've been able to reach out and start rebuilding sort of a vision for like what a Democrat looks like here, what's speaking to the concerns, what do kitchen table issues look like here? America is full of different kinds of kitchen tables, different people. Of course, those kitchen table issues are different. But precisely because, I had seen, so many cases I had been following so many groups of, anti-Trump activists or, pro-democracy activists who had been, trying to organize protests, trying to diversify their groups, trying to get involved and, reach out, they thought, to, a broader, younger, more class diverse range of people, and succeeding almost not at all. This is part of what was so stunning to me about watching what unfolded after the murder of George Floyd and in the wave of protests that followed, in place after place after place. The people who stepped forward to lead those protests in an enormous majority of places were completely disconnected from everything I had been following. And were coming and were, sort of organically coming from groups and networks and demographic group, clusters that had just not been, who had not been mobilized into action by any of the previous things that I've been seeing. So the people who stepped forward to again, not just to participate in and to lead protests under the banner of Black Lives Matter, to organize vigils for George Floyd, to speak out about police violence, about systematic racism, about structural racism, were in place after place in Pennsylvania, which is what I've studied most carefully. High school students or recent high school graduates, young people in their 20s, very class diverse, very ethnically diverse, very racially diverse. So in Eastern Pennsylvania towns where the largest minority are Latinx people who might be like of Dominican or Puerto Rican ancestry, people whose families moved there from the Bronx. And those are the young people who've had in those communities the most direct experiences of racism and over-policing. Those were the people who stepped forward to lead those protests.
Do you yet have a sense of where they might be headed with this energy?
So that's part of, absolutely, we see sort of the incipient stages of the same kinds of self-perpetuating sort of centripetal circle in which people are pulled into deeper civic engagement through having stepped forward to protest in the first place. So the story that I told about the women's marches and other the protests about the Muslim ban and so on, where I said, people step forward out of a sense of a sort of personal impulse, or sometimes with one friend stepping forward with them, and then they find other people and they start talking about what do we do next? And they, along the way, meet politicians and realize that those politicians should answer to them, or maybe they should become those politicians. So they begin creating personal connections and capacity that then make it all the more possible for them to be effective politically and to want to be effective politically and to be able to be emotionally invested in being effective politically. Those same patterns we saw happening over the month of June and July for people who were coming from a place of much less privilege to start with and much less sort of political entitlement to start with.
To what extent, and this comes from the question, the Q&A as well, are economic issues motivating activism these days, do you think?
Are economic issues?
Economic issues, economic injustice, inequality, motivating activism. Are you seeing that at all?
So, I mean, I think it would be, I couldn't parse out for you as distinct issues of structural, I mean, the very notion of structural racism already, speaks to the enmeshment of the, political, legal, institutional, and economic. And that, like, if I say it that way, it sounds like it's really jargony, but in people's lives, like, they know that it all works together, right? So people look around them and see who has jobs and who's lost them. They see who is an essential worker and yet doesn't get personal protective equipment from their bosses. They see, you know, who still has hours on that shift, and yet they see, you know, shareholders, or even just like, you know, all the locally well-connected folks seem to be doing just fine. So what, you know, some analysts from above are now describing as the K-shaped recovery, in which you've got some Americans during coronavirus very rapidly starting to do better than ever, right? Didn't lose any hours at work. Their annual salaries looking fine, moving forward. And other people, yeah, value of my house, never better. Other people facing enormous, taking sort of body blows to their economic situation and their work possibilities. So in many places, the local Black Lives Matter protests drew from sort of locally, were often headlined by folks who were at the harsh, the painful end of the K-shaped recovery, but also drew in some people locally who were actually not that hard hit, but who were, you know, who felt an ethical obligation to show up and put themselves on that side, right? And that's really striking. That is not something that we've seen so routinely within American history. So this sort of loops back to one of the questions about the media and reporting. In places where local media still exist, one is able to go read, you know, a description of what that protest looked like. Because I should say, we tracked protests, Black Lives Matter protests, or George Floyd vigil, George Floyd memorials, happened in at least 230 different communities within the state of Pennsylvania alone across the month of June. So that is mind-blowing. That is 10 times as many places as ever held a Tea Party protest. It is 10 times as many places as ever held a women's march or women's march related protest in Pennsylvania. And so we're talking about really small places. So it's even just getting reporting on what happened can be hard, but if you track it down, you can find often, you know, like videos that people took of the speeches that were being made and what people were saying. And in place after place, you had like young people and people of color stepping forward to talk about their life experiences within this community to an audience made up of other members of the community who didn't share those experiences. That's a big deal.
Got it. Fascinating to see how it's extended in so many different ways. So I can see on our in our conversation we have many great historians, and I have to ask how it was you came to how it was you moved from the issues that engaged you earlier in your career to this pursuit, and what is it that you're bringing as an historian to this study? Is it something you were just passionate about because, look what's happening in my community, or was there a little bit more forethought to it?
No, there was no forethought. So I began in the wake of Donald Trump's election. I started looking around to see what was happening politically in my state Senate district, actually. So I, you know, myself as someone who had been periodically I knocked doors for Barack Obama in 2008. I'd been sort of involved in some canvassing with different campaigns, but not in any sustained way. And like so many people, I looked around after the election of Donald Trump and was like, you know, what can I do? I noticed for the first time that I had a Republican state senator, even though I live within the city of Pittsburgh, in a ward that I think our ward voted 95% for Hillary Clinton, possibly it was 96. So wow. And yet there are two wards of the city of Pittsburgh that had been gerrymandered into a suburban, and at the time heavily Republican, state Senate district. So I started looking around to say, like, well, you know, is someone going to run against this Republican state senator who had not faced a Democratic challenger in the past election? And I thought, well, you know, maybe there would be some way of connecting people in the city who I think of as like, you know, all these, you know, liberals in the city. Maybe we can connect them so they can work, or somehow here I am, like, innocently, ignorantly projecting my ignorance onto the suburbs. I was like, you know, probably there are probably only Republicans out there. And so I started looking, and to my shock, I found all of this organizing happening out in the suburbs, in what had been sort of traditionally Republican-dominated suburbs to the north of the city of Pittsburgh, there was so much more happening there. New groups being formed in place after place, organizing locally in place after place. And it was both shocking to me because it ran against my, ignorant prior vision of what might be happening there, but also because it didn't mesh what I was reading about in the papers. You know, when I was reading about the resistance and opposition to Donald Trump, I was not reading about, retired librarians in well-heeled suburbs, but that's what I was seeing. And that's what made me really interested in what was happening here. And that's how I began then I shifted into sort of more systematically gathering information, interviewing people, and ended up starting to write about the phenomenon as well.
Do you see that as a role for historians or just generally interested citizens who can bring rigor to it, or how do you see it?
I mean, for me, it has been quite striking to see that I feel like there's a sort of underserved niche for, of course, it's long form journalism still exists, and that's really important, but journalists need to be specialists in lots of different places, and need to be attentive to many different things. And political science, people who do academic research more often are on a different time frame in terms of gathering and publishing research. And so a discipline like political science often has been, over the last generation, maybe more focused on answering somewhat narrower questions with the methodological tools that are most prized within that discipline. That's understandable. Same thing is true of economics and so on. But historians, as you know, because you hang out with historians a lot, historians bring up real methodological variety to the table. I think most historians would say, I want to explain what's happening in this place and time, and I will talk about phenomena that are taking place really slowly if I see that as being central to it. And I'll also talk about things happening fast. I'll talk about really local things, but I'll also talk about broader national or transnational phenomenon if that's needed to explain what I'm seeing. And that turns out to be a sort of helpful, sort of basic epistemology to bring to the table in terms of talking about current politics, because it isn't trying to tell a single story it's not trying to parse out different factors. We're trying to, as historians, we're often talking about how things come together in a particular way.
And what an extraordinary luxury, I imagine, that you're actually interviewing the subjects of your work. Something you didn't get to do with those earlier books. That's been quite
striking for me, right? And I hadn't done oral history interviewing, for instance, previously, and so it's been interesting and exciting for me to move into doing that and to discover how much I can learn by, talking to people and asking them, and sometimes telling them, well, here's what I think is happening, and hearing people argue back at me, be like, no, that's not why I did that at all. That's great. Tell me more.
This may not make much sense, but is it history you're doing? It's so unfinished, this moment. We don't know where it's headed. Is that frustrating to you, given that you're used to looking at something that kind of happened already?
No, I think, luckily historians, we don't think that we should be able to predict the future. So there's that famous phrase, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. That is not something that I routinely hear professional academic historians say, because what academic historians or historical researchers say is it's all really complicated, right? Like the fact that X happened in this way at this time, does that make something foreordained? No, it's always really complicated how things come together. So we can't even predict the past, much less predict the future. So I don't know, maybe that makes it possible for me to be a little hopeful, and even as I'm writing about things that actually make me pretty despairing, because I know that we're all immersed in this particular moment in time, and probably therefore really unable to see some of the most important shifts or trends that are happening right now are invisible to all of us, for sure, including me. So I'm just doing my best to capture what I'm seeing right now in the moment.
Well, that sense, that ability to see, to recognize, and proclaim nuance and complexity is something that kind of is often missing from the media landscape. I was struck by a piece you have actually in the current American Prospect, where you were talking about the pros and cons of canvassing, of door knocking. And you have Republicans broadly around the country knocking on doors the way they always did and having face-to-face conversation. We've seen the president have his rallies, and the Democrats, certainly the Biden campaign until yesterday when they announced that in 4 states they would do some door knocking, have said, no, we're going to, we're just going to do everything virtually. And so there have been many news journalist takes that, say canvassing good, canvassing bad, but you found it's not nearly so clear.
Yeah, and that's a good example. I mean, the evidence, if you start parsing out the academic and other evidence about the impact of canvassing, the answer is that it's complicated, but it's not like chaotically, there are real patterns. It's not that there's nothing that we can say about canvassing. There are things we can absolutely say about canvassing, and that is that the impact of face-to-face canvassing varies depending on the context that unifies the person who's doing the asking and the person who's being asked, right? So it's not really about the technique at all, and for sure it's not some kind of vast gulf between face-to-face canvassing and phone canvassing and text banking, for instance. If the ways in which different techniques of voter contacting play out, what their consequences are, vary pretty systematically, so that if a campaign is doing a sort of industrial scale, sending out a volunteer army, maybe people from out of state or out of region with a tight script and orders to go knock on a series of anonymous doors, enter the data in minivan and head back, that's going to be not particularly impactful. It's not going to be particularly impactful in the short term in terms of shifting people's votes. It's going to generate a little bit of possibly useful data for the campaign. But conversely, if you've got people knocking on doors within their own community, and having conversations with people with whom they so in particular, if you've got people knocking on doors in their own neighborhood, so it's people who have a pre-existing connection to each other, those conversations are super impactful. But also, we see that many of the most important impacts of door-to-door canvassing are not actually about what moves the voter at all, and about the connections built between canvassers, about knowledge that canvassers gain of regular human beings' political views within their community, knowledge that they gain of political hierarchies within their community and what they might do about them. So there actually are lots of externalities to different voter contacting strategies that mean that the midterm and mid-range and long-range implications of choosing to do, for instance, face-to-face canvassing is going to be one thing for a state rep campaign, which functions at that smaller geographic scale and pulls together people who have ongoing connections to it, versus a presidential campaign. So part of the argument that Dana Fisher and I were making in the American Prospect piece that you referenced is that no one on the sort of broad center to left should be, worrying or thinking that getting the Biden campaign out there doing door-to-door canvassing is the be-all and end-all. There are lots of other campaigns that are, and indeed, can arguably really should be doing face-to-face outreach for voter registration or to support a down-ballot candidate. And those are cases in which, investing the time and energy needed to do safe face-to-face canvassing, even at a time of coronavirus, could make good sense. But if it's just about doing the knocking on doors to gain no more, to have the sort of entirely superficial interaction that you could be gaining from a phone conversation or a text bank, then just do it by the phone or by text bank. Don't think that there's somehow something magically different is happening if you're doing it by knocking on a door.
Well, and it's that depth of perception that you have that's so valuable. And often reporters don't take the time, or don't have the time, or don't go so deep. I was, for a piece I've just finished on the ground game in Wisconsin, I asked the Trump campaign to tell me about their ground game. And let me read you what they said, and you can tell me if it has any meaning whatsoever. They were very pleased with it. Wisconsin Trump victory has contacted over 9.8 million voters in the state just this cycle. Our team in Wisconsin has held over 1,800 trainings with over 6,000 attendees and held over 2,000 Make America Great Again meetups with over 21,400 attendees. Does that tell you anything? Or is that just the thing that, you know, a campaign would throw out and say, see, we're great?
I mean, so it's hard to know. It's hard to know what to make of those numbers. So it's hard to know what to make of those numbers without knowing more than they're going to be willing to tell you about the context in which that's happening.
That's the point,
so,
right? They don't really actually want to talk about it. They just want to say, look how great.
The voter, so more meaningful are precisely the numbers of sort of how many people came together in a meetup, right? So the numbers that refer to how many volunteers they have coming together to do things together, those I take seriously. And as we started out, you know, when we started out talking, we noted that I said there's intense enthusiasm for Donald Trump among his supporters right now. So I don't want to minimize that or say that they're somehow not reflecting something important there. It's also the case that there was a really interesting article in the Iowa Starting Line newspaper this week describing the Trump campaign in Iowa by, you know, with reporting and a whole bunch of interviews with people who had left the Trump campaign, describing an enormous pressure to produce, you know, numbers of contacts with voters to the exclusion of any meaningful contact with voters. Right. And also like tight policing of who the paid and so these were all paid canvassers, yeah. Tight policing of who they could talk to. So people describe being, you know, dressed down, like, you know, yelled at.
Right.
For having talked to the county committee in this or that county of Iowa. So that was really interesting reporting, and that is totally believable because that's what the Clinton campaign looks like. It looked like in a lot of places. It's what campaigns that absorb the, you know, the message that they should be, you know, contacting voters and creating a massive ground game, and don't absorb the message that actually the connections matter.
Sure. That's
what they produce, and it's close to a Potemkin village. Like it's just, there's nothing there. You can just knock it over. There's nothing's being left behind there. So it's hard to say.
It is. So we have, let me remind people who are here with us, if you have a question, send it to the Q&A. Michael Allen is wondering, drawing on your expertise on the Caribbean, can you share your sense of Trump's strength among Hispanic and Latino voters, for example, in Florida, his standing in Florida generally? Is it something you followed at all?
Only a little, only enough to know that there are really important things happening there that I think are being vastly underreported, and I would love to be reading more really solid investigation about this. So, and there are like just two basic points that I think are crucial drivers here that we need to know more about. One is the flows of misinformation and disinformation on WhatsApp in particular, which have been a characteristic for the last 3 years of elections across Latin America. I've read enough reporting and heard enough from a few people on the ground there to think that there's intense hidden from public vision communications and outreach going on there. So in particular, targeting Venezuelan immigrants, so Venezuelan and Cuban immigrant communities within Florida, and to a lesser extent, Puerto Rican communities within Florida. So,
can you share what some of those are? Can you give us an example of what you're hearing is going on?
Sure. Well, a lot of the same content that you and I have seen in the sort of Q adjacent world of assertions about, you know, claims about Joe Biden, claims about corruption, claims about pedophilia, claims about the Democrats, linked to, especially in communications that are going out to Venezuelan and Cuban immigrant communities, claims tightly linking the Democrats to socialism and communism, right? So you've got communities of people who left behind Chavez's Venezuela, communities of people who left behind Fidel Castro's Cuba, so for whom assertions about socialism and communism are particularly motivating, and so a lot of disinformation and of intense claims being made about who had a secret meeting with whom and who is committed to do what and so on. So that's going on, but we know how much, who's coordinating, what voices are driving the spread of rumors and false claims. I've yet to find a good a source of reporting on that. It's been fragmentary, so we need to hear more.
On reporting, it is widely accepted that the mainstream media, the quality media, botched 2016. Mm-hmm. Partly by not taking Trump seriously early enough, although certainly by November of 2016, anybody who cared to know what he was about did. But more importantly, basically failed to get out of the office and understand Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, places where people were so disaffected either with politics in general or the Democratic Party or despised Hillary Clinton. What are you seeing this year? How is the media doing? You mentioned, gee, I'm sure it'd be great to have more reporting on this in Florida, but broadly, what's your perception?
I mean, on the one hand, there are so many heroes out there in the media, and the individual stories that get written are often great, and the individual journalists who I speak with, because it turns out you can build a lifetime of knowledge about Caribbean 19th century migration and no one calls you, but when you're one of the few people who does academic research on Western Pennsylvania politics, suddenly you're an expert in something that people care about expertise in. So I've talked to more reporters in the last year than ever previously. Individually, people are super thoughtful and really nuanced, and yet the totality of once that gets processed through the multiple layers of editing and curation and then filters of what actually gets heard, what end up as the headlines out there that are getting circulated, miss all of that. And so much so that it's not even just like, well, that's really a narrow slice. It's just, it gets the story wrong. If you just, so it sort of depends on what it's not just a question of what reporting is being created, which is a vast and varied and often really important, valuable panorama, but it's what ends up getting circulated, how much, and extracted, and then what reaches people. So the reaching people, it's like the last mile of the U.S. media ecosystem is really broken, right? And in part because that last mile is now no longer reaching out to, 3/4 of American people, I think.
It must be disturbing to you when you see the richness of what is going on, that isn't getting out.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if I had if I had a magic wand, I think, and limitless money, one thing that I would do would be to create more opportunities for high school students from across America to actually intern with or work with local newspapers, because I don't think that what even is the news, what even is the media is no longer something that is within the vocabulary or daily experience of people in so many different places. And therefore people are prone to believe what they're told about, fake news or bias. And that shouldn't surprise us when people have not been exposed to any other notion of what work, who reporters are, what they do, what they're aiming for, what their, ethics and standards are.
Nobody knows a reporter anymore. So few people do. It's really true.
Especially, and the collapse of local newspapers has been just devastating for this country in that sense.
Well, I notice you often tweet local stories, including Philadelphia Inquirer pieces, but also even more local ones.
Yeah, much more.
So a question from Ruby. Regarding Trump campaign's manic but shallow contact with voters. I have been bombarded with texts from the Trump campaign and the occasional taped phone message. I have no idea why I'm being contacted, except that I'm from a rural county in Ohio. What do you think?
Yep, that sounds like the targeting that you know, the rural Ohio for sure is an area where the Trump campaign right now is quite aware that they need to be trying desperately to shore up their strength. So that's really interesting experience that is being described there, and it's consistent with this exactly a sort of wide targeting of not necessarily personally engaged voter contacts.
And what the Trump campaign has realized is it's, well, partly because of the behavior of the principal of President Trump himself, is their base is the only thing they can grow. They're simply, and you've written a fair bit about this, they're losing suburban women, they're losing people in an array of demographics where, or peeling people away. The Biden campaign is peeling people away in various demographics. And so they're thinking, and I know this from work I've done in Arizona and in Wisconsin, they're saying, okay, who can we energize who may not have voted before or may not have voted for us in the kinds of places where we think our strength lies?
Yeah.
I think we're winding up pretty soon, but I am wondering if we could for a moment look ahead, because one of the great things about your work is that you're not focused on specific events, but a continuum. Where are we headed after November? And of course, it's hard to know without knowing what happens in November, but in terms of these we won't call them movements, these energized efforts at the grassroots and local levels, where do you think they go? Do they keep building?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, I'm reasonably confident that those dynamics of civic engagement and sort of creating a virtuous cycle rather than a vicious cycle of sort of people do more, meet more people, feel positively reinforced, feel effective, and therefore do more. It's a virtuous cycle of civic engagement. I'm reasonably confident that that's going to continue on in all of the sort of suburban grassroots or you know, center-left, women-led grassroots groups. The groups themselves may not continue on, but the networks will, right? It's not just about individuals, but it's also not just about any given Facebook group or any given indivisible group. The interpersonal connections that have been built will continue on, and precisely because people have built up the structures that they need in order to engage locally, in some cases with sort of nested local, regional, and up to state level connections. So I think of it as being, you know, in contrast to, you know, Obama for America built a very regimented, thorough, impressive data operation connecting a whole bunch of volunteers to each other through the Obama for America structure. And then after President Obama was elected, there were people who owned that structure. Like literally there's someone owned the data, you know, had the structure of, it was a centralized, nested, hierarchical thing. And then they dithered about what to do with it. There were fights about whether the DNC would own it, whether Obama would own it as a campaign or as a governing strategy, you know, with Obama as president or about the Obama campaign. Ultimately, they de facto dissolved it. They didn't turn it into an ongoing movement. So that cannot happen this time, precisely because no one owns this. The Biden campaign they didn't build this. But also, you know, the folks at Indivisible National HQ also don't own this, also didn't build it. Their infrastructure has been relevant to it, but it's something which is much more diverse, but also like locally engaged. And I sort of picture it as like the cherry tomato plant that I planted outside in front of my house and just sprawled all over everything in a way that, you know, looks really messy, not always really effective. It doesn't always produce, but it's like the branches grew strong, like where it's sustainable, because where it grew because it could sustain itself there. So it's not regimented. It's not consistent everywhere. It's not always working. But there's an organicness to the forms that this shift has taken in place after place. People have found allies and started doing stuff with them. And all of those have a momentum that are going to carry forward.
So long live cherry tomato plants. May we all go out and plant them. You surprised a reporter, by your own account, when you said, if Trump wins,
Oh, yeah.
this will the activists will come back even more strongly. You believe that?
Yeah. I mean, it was surprising to me that this very savvy, super subtle reporter was surprised that I was so confident, especially because I'm never confident about the future. Who even knows? But these people I know. So this sector, the folks who've become super active grassroots activists who've run a campaign, whether for local or state or national office every year since 2017, and who at this point have all of their friends are their political friends. The people who they've met through, they have the friends they had before, but some friends they had before have been pulled into politics, and the people who they met through politics have been pulled into their core groups of their core social networks. So there's a density to these connections, and the folks who have become involved in these groups, especially, again, it's the people who stepped forward after Donald Trump's election and said, this is not my America. Their self-identification as people who fight for democracy is so strong that I don't see people saying, oh, well, Donald Trump was reelected, something went wrong, we didn't do what we wanted to, and now things are going to get even radically, all the things that we said that we cared about are going to get worse. But let me just go back to, organizing banquets for fundraisers for my local, beautification community, and because we failed. That's not going to happen.
Very encouraging.
No, I mean, it's not encouraging though, because, this fantasy of at some level, they're not quite right about how much they matter. But on the other hand, it really matters that they believe that they matter. Right?
Boy, we could talk another hour about that. That's fascinating too. Okay, a final question, very simple. And you said you hate to try to predict the future, but who will win Pennsylvania, Trump or Biden?
I mean, I would be surprised if Donald Trump won Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm. Because
all of the recent polling is consistent with what we've seen in electoral results in 2018, in 2019, sort of an up and down ballot, which is to say the forces, the dynamics that have shifted parts of Pennsylvania more firmly into allegiance to Donald Trump are ongoing, but the dynamics that have pushed other parts of Pennsylvania, in particular fast-growing suburbs and suburban areas, into active engagement with Democratic politics and support for the Biden campaign, those dynamics are ongoing as well. So again, Pennsylvania is a state with multiple moving pieces moving in opposite directions, and all of those pieces are still moving, but the balance of that, how that nets out in the end, I think the votes are going to be there for. Right now, Joe Biden is doing less poorly than Hillary Clinton in some of the sort of older one-time Democratic strongholds, the older sort of Rust Belt areas. Joe Biden is also doing much better than Hillary Clinton in more cosmopolitan or upscale exurbs and suburbs. And for all of the news value of things that have happened over the last 24 hours and the last week, actually everything that's happened over everything from the debate to the tax returns revealed to Donald Trump contracting coronavirus is going to actually tend to push in the direction of I think having more voters at the end of the day voting for Joe Biden in Pennsylvania.
Got it. Well, gosh, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. I feel a lot smarter, and I'm just so glad you're on the case, looking at this so rigorously and creatively and finding all these sources that we otherwise just don't know about. It's really a wonderful thing. And I want to, in addition to thanking you, I want to end with something for everyone from your daughter. And you shared this on Twitter, and it happens to be a Friday, so it's especially appropriate. Your daughter, who's 8 years old, had just finished her lessons, and she emailed you, as we know from your Twitter, with these words: 1, it's Friday. 2, read. 3, say hello to your friends. And 4, with 6 exclamation points, vote. So on that happy note, we thank you for doing this. John, would you
So
like
much.
to?
It's been
Thank you
wonderful
both.
to have the chance to join you all.
Likewise.
This is wonderful. Thank you both. Thank you, Lara. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Glad to do it. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.